value artificially low to hold down the price of exports. A vote on ending debate is expected today. This is live Senate coverage on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by the Reverend D. Edward Cheney, Senior Pastor of Second Baptist Church in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Let us pray. Bless us now, O God. Touch our hearts, for without your love, light, and life, we are nothing. Give our lawmakers strength and courage as they make decisions today that impact the lives of all Americans. Lord, remove the divisive spirit that prohibits true transformation and allow your presence to become not just common, but harmonious. Through our dedication, commitment, and sacrifice, we thank you for cleansing us from the ills of this world and making us fit to serve and honor you. We ask these blessings in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor. Please join me in pledging allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Souvenir, Master. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., October 6, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Sheldon Whitehouse, a senator from the state of Rhode Island, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The distinguished majority leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the rare opportunity today to introduce and say a few words about the guest chaplain. Reverend Cheney has just delivered, as usual, an eloquent invocation. Reverend Cheney is originally from South Carolina, but for the last 2 years has led his flock at the Second Baptist Church in Las Vegas, one of the older, extremely well-established, large churches in Las Vegas, Nevada. He's a man who's involved in the community very, very deeply. He serves on the board of the Urban League and the NAACP, but in addition to his service in the spiritual line, he's also served as a patriot in our nation's armed services. He served the Navy for 4 years, as has our chaplain, Barry Black, both naval officers, and recently retired as chaplain in the United States Air Force Reserve at Nellis Air Force Base. I've met with Reverend Cheney under very unique circumstances on a number of occasions. He's a wonderful human being. He's one of those rare people who has such a pleasant demeanor the minute you meet him. You know he's a man of great substance and spiritual quality. So I'm very happy to welcome Reverend Cheney excuse me, and his wife Avis to Washington. I thank you, Pastor, for the invocation, which I hope will guide the Senate's action today. Mr. President, following leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of S-1619, the China currency legislation. The deadline for second-degree amendments to that legislation is at 10 a.m. this morning. At 10:30, there will be a roll call vote on the motion about cloture on S-1619. I'm told that S-1660 at the desk and due for a second reading.
The senator is correct. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S-1660, a bill to provide tax relief for American workers and businesses to put workers back on the job while rebuilding and modernizing America and to provide pathways back to work for Americans looking for jobs.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to this legislation.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Majority Leader?
Ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
This morning, the Senate will hold a vote to advance legislation in the underhanded practice of currency manipulation by the Chinese government. This practice, which gives Chinese exports a tremendously unfair advantage on all the global markets, but especially in the one with our relations with China. It hurts American manufacturers and cheats American workers out of jobs. It has helped balloon America's trade deficit with China from $10 billion to $273 billion in the last 20 years, costing upwards of 3 million jobs. 2 million of those lost jobs came from the manufacturing sector alone, which can't compete as long as the Chinese government gives its exporters special advantages. This legislation is a chance to even a tilted playing field, pump $300 billion into our economy in 2 years and support 1.6 million American jobs. That's why it has the support of labor unions and business groups. That's why it's advanced with an overwhelming bipartisan vote on Monday. I believe there were 31 Republican votes on Monday, Mr. President. I would remind my Republican colleagues that since the Senate began debate of this bill, China has made no move to correct the value of its currency. It's clear that merely considering congressional action would not solve this problem. So it would be difficult for me to comprehend how people could be switching their votes from Monday to Thursday. We've offered to work with Republicans on an agreement to consider several germane amendments. I stand by that offer. We talked about that yesterday, in fact, late last night. I repeat, more than 30 Republicans voted to advance this legislation earlier this week. So excuse me, I'm hopeful my colleagues on the other side will continue to work with us in a bipartisan fashion to advance this important job-creating legislation today. I've indicated to the Republican leader that I have a meeting with 3 of my senators at the White House at 5:30 this afternoon. So we either finish this bill, if in fact cloture is invoked, and we work out something on the amendments before 5:30, or we can come back tonight after the meeting at the White House, or we can come back tomorrow. But we're going to complete work on this legislation before we leave, one way or the other. If cloture is not invoked, of course, that ends it, which would be a sad day, I think, in the relations between China and the United States to think that we capitulated on something as important as this. We're going to finish this legislation today. I would like to do it before 5:30. We have the Jewish holiday that starts tomorrow at 5:30. It's actually an hour or so after that, about 20 till 7, sundown back here. But anyway, we're going to continue working on this legislation until we complete it one way or the other. Early next week, the Senate will begin debate on the American Jobs Act, which will create jobs while asking every American to contribute his or her fair share. This legislation will put construction crews back to work building the things that make our country stronger: modern bridges, roads, dams, sewers, water systems, and up-to-date schools where our children can get the best education possible. I've spent a lot of time with the Republican leader, knowing how strongly he and some other members of the Senate feel about the Colombia trade bill, the Korean trade agreement, and Panama. And in spite of my not feeling so strong about these, I'm not big fans of these matters, I'm doing my best to advance this so we can have a vote hopefully as early as Wednesday of next week.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
What this week has shown, beyond any doubt, is that Democrats would rather talk about partisan legislation they won't pass than on actually passing legislation we know would create jobs. 2.5 years after the President signed his first stimulus, there are 1.7 million fewer jobs in this country. And now he wants to do it again. Why? Because Democrats think it makes good politics. This week it was revealed that there wasn't enough support within the Democratic ranks to pass the President's so-called jobs bill. It was simply too partisan. So yesterday, instead of making it less partisan, they made it more so. By adding a tax on small business owners, they made it even less attractive to job creators rather than working with Republicans on legislation that would actually help create jobs. I mean, what's the goal here? If the goal is to create jobs, then why aren't we even talking about? Why are we even talking about tax hikes? The President himself has said that raising taxes is the last thing you want to do in a weak economy. That's the President of the United States. Even the White House predicts that unemployment rate will be high when this tax would kick in. So the real goal here for the Democrats, as far as I can tell, is entirely political. By arguing for a permanent tax hike to pay for a temporary stimulus, they are essentially admitting they're not particularly interested in creating jobs, because proposing a partisan tax hike 13 months before an election won't create one single job, not one. So I would suggest that our friends on the other side put away the playbook and work with us instead. As I've said repeatedly, Republicans are ready to act right away with Democrats on bipartisan, job-creating legislation, on the 3 trade bills, for instance, on regulatory reform, increasing American energy production, and tax reform. All those things would help the economy, and all could be strongly bipartisan. Yet Democratic leaders don't seem to be interested in working together on these kinds of things. 2 days ago, for example, I offered the President his request to vote on his second stimulus. Our Democratic friends blocked the vote. Instead of working across the aisle with Republicans on solutions that would help put people back to work, Democrats have fallen back to tired talking points, the same stale rhetoric we've heard literally for years. And with 14 million Americans out of work, this is completely and totally unacceptable. We're wasting valuable time. Despite the President assuring Americans that nobody is talking about raising taxes right now, and that a down economy was a horrible time to raise taxes, again, this is what the President said, the new Democratic tax hike would take effect in a little over a year, when CBO tells us the unemployment rate will still be well over 8%. It's no wonder that the economy is stagnant. Businesses aren't hiring, and unemployment is at 9%. How can anyone be expected to make plans when the next gotcha tax hike to pay for this President's spending binge is always lurking right around the corner? The President has said it's wrong to raise taxes in this weak economic environment. If he meant what he said, surely he'll join me in opposing this unwise tax hike Senate Democrats have proposed. Republicans, along with some Democrats, have pro-growth solutions to help solve this crisis. But we will not stand for a permanent tax hike for a temporary stimulus that is largely a rehash of the same stimulus ideas the administration has already tried. This bill is the same wasteful spending, the same burdensome union giveaways, and the same temporary tax policy that has failed the American people in the last 2 years. This economy can grow and create jobs when Washington reduces spending and regulations, and by simplifying our incredibly complex tax system. This is what's needed to literally unleash the private sector. It's time Democrats move beyond the political rhetoric and for the President to stop campaigning. It's time for Democrats to reach across the aisle on bipartisan legislation that can actually pass. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-1619, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 183, S-1619, a bill to provide for identification of misaligned currency, require action to correct the misalignment, and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the time until 10:30 a.m. will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees. The Senator from New York.
Just a point of clarification. Are we in morning business or are we on the bill?
We are on the bill, Senator.
I see. And there's an hour of time equally divided?
Until 10:30.
So the time is equally divided?
Correct.
Up to that point. Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, first, I'd just like to make a comment on the Republican leader's comment on the tax bill. Just make note, American people, the leader says don't raise taxes, but he does not mention what our proposal actually does. It imposes a 5.6% surcharge only on those whose incomes are above $1 million. In other words, 99% plus of American people will not have their taxes raised, nor should they. Average middle-class people are struggling. Their incomes are declining. We shouldn't be doing that. But for those who are the very wealthiest, and this is no aspersion to them, I think most of us on both sides of the aisle admire people who've made a lot of money. Most Americans would like to be in their shoes, and most of them have done it the hard way by coming up with a good idea, struggling, working a business. That's great. But they're the one segment in society whose income has actually increased significantly over the last decade. And the kinds of cuts we must do, the one consensus we have in this place is we have to reduce the deficit and reduce the budget. And the one consensus we have is that we have to do that. Well, you're asking middle-class people to chip in by making it harder to pay for college because student loans aren't as good, or cutting back on somebody who's been unemployed, worked their whole lives, lost their job, and now are unemployed. So how do you have the top 1%, the one part of society doing the best, chip in? Well, the only way is through the tax code, because they don't need they don't need help getting their kids to college. They don't need health care help. God bless them. They have enough money to do that on their own. So this is the only way to do it. And if you say no taxes on anybody, even the millionaires, which is what I assume my friend the Republican leader is saying, you're saying the best off in society who have done the best in the last decade should not contribute to this deficit reduction that we have to do. And I believe, and I'll say this again and again, that the only way we're going to get real deficit reduction is by raising revenues as well as cutting spending. And the only real way we're going to break through on raising revenues is making sure those at the highest income contribute, and contribute more than others when it comes to the tax system. Now, I'd like to go to the bill at hand, which is 1619, the Currency Act. And I know my colleagues have heard me on this all week. It's passionate for me. It's passionate not as a Democrat or not against Republicans. In fact, we've religiously tried throughout, Lindsey Graham and I, Senator Graham and I, throughout the history of this bill, which is a long one, and the bills before it, their predecessors, we have tried to keep this religiously bipartisan. In fact, we have 5 lead Democratic sponsors and 5 lead Republican sponsors. Lindsey and I have opposed presidents on this issue, whether it be the Republican President Bush or the Democrat President Obama, with equal vigor, because we think administrations get too caught up in that highfalutin diplomatic world to understand what American companies, particularly middle-sized companies, go through when China doesn't play fair. And I'm on the floor on this bill many times, more often than I usually speak, because I feel passionately this is about the future of America, Mr. President. If we continue to lose wealth and jobs to China because they manipulate trade laws and intellectual property laws and all kinds of other economic laws for their own advantage, unfairly, against the WTO rules, against the rules of free trade, we may never recover as a country. This is serious stuff. This is not to gain political advantage, although most Americans agree with it, of course. But I would do this if most Americans didn't, and, editorialists don't, business leaders, multinational corporations don't. Do this because when you have small companies that are growing, that have great products, and China unfairly competes with them, not because China's products are better, but because China's trade allows it to undercut them here in our market and in the Chinese market, you're giving away your seed corn. Take solar cells. China usually uses a 1-2 punch to hurt us unfairly. First, they will use some trade law to get that business in their country, whether it's rare earths, and they say you want these rare earths, you got to manufacture in China. Whether it's intellectual property, they just take it, regardless of patent laws and other laws. Or, in the case of solar cells, whether it's unfair direct subsidies to companies, and they say, you make the solar cells here, the Chinese companies, you'll get deep subsidies. But that alone wouldn't be enough to put our American companies on their butts. What happens is after they unfairly take the business and move them there, they send them here at a 30% discount using currency manipulation. And our American companies, and I've spoken to company after company, in manufacturing businesses, in service businesses, and things in between, and they say, I can compete, my product is usually better, but not against a 30% currency disadvantage, so the price of the Chinese good is 30% cheaper. There's a window manufacturer I just visited, I think it was last Friday. And he makes these high-end windows for these buildings in New York and elsewhere. And the window he makes is better than the Chinese window. This wasn't a theft of intellectual property. And he wouldn't use the Chinese windows because he's a contractor as well. He makes the windows and then he installs. He says, I wouldn't use the Chinese product. But because it has a 30% advantage in currency, it undercuts me in price and lots of other people use it. Now, who would have thought that we're talking about windows? The Chinese are competing against us everywhere. High-end, middle-end, low-end. On the low end, frankly, we'll never get the businesses back. Toys or clothing or shoes, maybe even furniture, except high-end furniture, not coming back. And the argument that some of these editorialists use, well, they're going to go to Bangladesh or somewhere else if China has to raise its currency, is true, but that's not what we're fighting for here. We're fighting for high and middle-end companies that have great products, solar panels, that America has a future in, jobs that if China played fairly, we'd win because we make a better product and it doesn't have to be exported. And yet, we somehow sit here and twiddle thumbs. What I was saying about the window guy is not only now does China compete in manufacturing the windows, Chinese companies come here and install them. Again, it's still a 30% advantage because they're paying that Chinese company and workers in yuan, which is undervalued by 30% over there. So, this is serious stuff. It's about the future of America, Mr. President, about the future of American jobs. We're all concerned about jobs. There are very few jobs bills that are A, bipartisan, and B, don't cost money. This is one of them. It's been a bipartisan bill all the way. The vote showed it. I see my colleague from Alabama, who's been a great partner. I saw my colleague from South Carolina, who's been a great partner. How else, in this deadlocked, gridlocked situation, can we help American workers in a bipartisan way that doesn't cost money, in a big way? This is it. There aren't many others. So I would ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Leader Reid said on the floor a few minutes ago what he has said last night, that he would certainly entertain amendments and come to an agreement, amendments from both sides of the aisle, relevant, germane amendments, relevant to trade. I'm sure if we could move on cloture, Senator Hatch's amendment, he's the ranking member of the Trade Committee, of the Finance Committee, which deals with trade, would be debated. We'd try to have time limits. There'd be a fair and open debate on an important issue, and then we could vote on the bill. So I hope we will get a positive vote on cloture this morning. And I hope we will, not for political gain or anything like that, but for American gain. We cannot continue to let China flaunt the rules. When they were 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, when Senator Graham and I started on this, China was a much smaller economy. Now they are huge, the second largest in the world. They compete against us up and down the line. They have found 6 ways from Sunday to lure businesses there. And that deals with the Chinese market. But then with trade currency, when the businesses go there with currency manipulation, they're able to undercut us and send the goods here. Again, to me, and I'm just one person, And obviously I feel this issue more passionately than 9% of Americans because I've been involved in it so long. But to me, if you could do 5 things to restore American jobs and restore American wealth, this would be one of them. This would be one of them. I want to see, Mr. President, our children and grandchildren know that they're going to have better lives than their parents and grandparents. And it's a difficult and tough world to ensure that, with global competition, with so many changes. We were just talking in the gym about how our kids spend so much time on video games all day long instead of learning in school. There are so many challenges that we face as a country. And at this time, we can't just shrug our shoulders and be benign like maybe 20 or 25 years ago when we were in a different situation. Say, if China cheats, so what? Let's not risk any change. Let's not get them mad. We can't afford that anymore. The future of America is at stake. And to those who say it'll cause a trade war, we are in a trade war. We have our clocks cleaned every day and lose jobs every day because of unfair Chinese practices. To those who say if China will retaliate, China's got far more to lose in this than we do. They're the ones who benefit from all these rules. We don't, all these manipulations. They won't retaliate. Yeah, they may do a little thing here and there, but they will not retaliate big time because it'll do even more damage to the Chinese economy. What they will do, and Senator Graham and I have seen this, and Senator Sessions and Senator Brown, when they're faced with the hard reality that they will no longer be allowed by legislation, or I wish by administration action, but that hasn't been forthcoming from either President Bush or President Obama, they then adjust and play fairer. That is what has happened every single time. And that will happen again. So I want to first compliment my colleagues on this legislation. I want to hope and pray, I really pray in this one, me, for the future of America. And the future of America is linked to free and fair trade with China. The future of America is linked to the fact that we can no longer let China unfairly take advantage of American workers, American wealth, and the American future. I yield the floor and reserve the balance of my time.
Madam President.
The Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much. I rise in support of moving forward on this legislation. I wish I could fix the Senate. It's not functioning the way any of us would like. Plenty of blame to go around. The Congress is at 15%. But here's some good news. There is a piece of legislation before us that if we could ever get a vote on the legislation would have an overwhelming bipartisan support that actually would matter to the average everyday person. When you look to your Congress, you've got to say, what is it about these folks up there? Why can't they do the things that all of us know need to be done? Now, there's a difference of opinion about how to deal with China. This is a complicated issue, but the one thing no one's telling me on the other side, Lindsey, they're not manipulating the currency. I think it's the American Taxpayers Union, great organization. I'm pretty good standing with them. I just disagree with them on how to proceed against China in this particular instance. I think they said in their own letter, we agree China manipulates their currency. Well, if they do manipulate their currency, what does it matter? It matters a lot if you're an American businessman or woman trying to compete in the world marketplace. As Senator Schumer said, the Chinese manipulate the value of their currency. It's 6.3 yuan to the dollar. It used to be 8 point something. What does that mean? That means if a product produced in China is sold in the world marketplace and you're in business in South Carolina, Alabama, or New York competing with that Chinese company, the value of their money bills a discount to 30 to 40%, and you're going to have a very hard time winning in the marketplace, not because you don't work hard, not because your employees are inferior, simply because the Chinese government is doing things with their currency we don't do. Now, we have a Federal Reserve. Some of their policies I don't agree with, but to suggest that our Federal Reserve System manipulates our currency to create a trade advantage is ridiculous. If we're doing it for that purpose, everybody should be fired because we have a $273 billion trade deficit. Every country has a right to set monetary policy. That's not the issue. If you disagree with the way we're doing monetary policy in the United States, I think you have a valid claim. This is about a country manipulating their currency for an advantage in the export market. The Chinese manipulation of the yuan has cost this country at least 2 million jobs, 41,000 in South Carolina, and it is an unfair trade practice in another name. If this were an island nation somewhere, none of us would care, but this is the second or third largest economy in the world, and all of us should care. The people who are opposing this legislation today are probably doing business in China, and they're afraid to offend the Chinese. I've got some manufacturing in my state that has a big footprint in China, and they're nervous about this bill. I have most people in my state dying for me to get them some relief so they can stay in business. But here's a warning. It will come, this movie will come to a neighborhood near you soon. In 2016, the Chinese are going to start producing in large numbers commercial aircraft. It will be difficult for American aircraft companies to compete with China if the aircraft is 30% discounted because of currency manipulation. One day they'll be producing cars, not to be sold in China, but throughout the world. If you're in a high-tech industry, what has happened to the textile industry and other elements of our economy like steel is coming towards you. And all we ask of China is build cars, build airplanes, but sell your product based on trade practices that are accepted throughout the world. Don't manipulate your currency to create a discount on products made in your country at our expense. Now, since 2004, I've been dealing with this. We started with a sense of the Senate because everybody says this is delicate. I buy into that to a point. So, sense of the Senate, we all agreed like 100 votes. You manipulate your currency, please stop. In 2005, after they didn't stop, we introduced legislation, got 67 votes to proceed forward with the 27.5% tariff. We stopped our bill because we hoped things would change. And guess what? The yuan's appreciated about 31% since we've been doing this exercise, but not nearly enough. There's a restriction on the yuan trading. It can't float more than 0.5% a day. It's tied to the dollar, and it's still crushing our manufacturing community unfairly. So from 2004 to now, I've been reasonable. I've sent message amendments. I've taken votes where I won overwhelmingly and backed off. I've had it. Enough is enough. I am sorry the amendment process around this place is so screwed up. It is. There was an effort to get some amendments up, not as much as people on our side would like. I hate the idea of filling up the tree and becoming the House. But this is not about Senate procedure for me. I try to be a team player where I can be because I do believe Senator McConnell is doing a very good job. Senator Reid's got his own agenda. It's not about Harry Reid. It's not about Mitch McConnell. It's not about some rule of the Senate. It's about people in my state who are going to lose their job if we don't do something. So I know what I need to be doing as a senator here. The institution I need to be protecting is the American workforce who is having their clock cleaned by a communist dictatorship who cheats. They don't outwork us. They don't outperform us. They steal our intellectual property. They manipulate their currency. They subsidize their industries. A few years ago, they dumped steel all over the world in the American marketplace in particular, produced in China below cost, and the Bush administration pushed back with a countervailing duty claim. I want to do business with China. The Chinese people are good. Their government is bad. They're mercantilist. They look at every transaction from an eye of what is best for us in the short term. They don't play by the rules. Since they've been in the WTO, the trade deficit has almost quadrupled. So enough is enough for Lindsey Graham. We're going to have a chance after 7 years of getting a vote that will matter to the American people. And I'm sorry we're mad at each other all the time about everything. I am tired of being mad about the Senate not working well. I am going to set aside my displeasure for the process and do something I think will help the people that I represent. I'm going to vote to move forward in an imperfect procedural environment, knowing that if we can ever get a vote It will be the best thing that could happen to the American manufacturing community. It would be a shot across China's bow that's long overdue. And the last thing I would say, that Senator Sessions has come into this issue. He has brought an intellectual weight to it, emotional commitment. He understands the middle class, and Jeff Sessions has been the best partner anyone could hope to have to try to push a bill forward that will give America a fighting chance in a world economy dominated by a communist dictatorship unfairly. So I just want to recognize what Jeff has done. He's going to vote to move forward. We've had it with China. Let's do something that will matter. With that, I yield.
President?
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I've been very interested in the comments of the distinguished senator from New York and my friend from South Carolina as well. But this morning, the Senate will have the opportunity to send a strong message to China and the world community. Now, whether that signal is one of inward protectionism or outward engagement remains to be seen. In my mind, the choice is clear. If we support the motion to invoke cloture on the underlying bill, we will be sending a signal to China that the U.S. Senate is angry over China's manipulation of its currency, but we are not really serious about taking real long-term action to stop it. We are also telling the world community that the U.S. is turning inward once again, seeking protectionist solutions to global problems, and not really interested in working with other countries to solve our current international economic crisis. At the same time, we would be interjecting further uncertainty into our own economic recovery as our exporters and workers face potential retaliation from one of our leading trading partners. There is a better way, and it can be bipartisan. We can defeat cloture and give senators an opportunity to vote on my amendment, which not only has the best chance of actually resolving our serious currency problems with China, but also demonstrates to the international community that the United States will continue to lead by promoting trade liberalization and holding countries accountable to the rules of the game for the long haul. If given the chance to vote on my amendment, we can demonstrate our serious commitment to developing long-term and meaningful solutions to the persistent problem of currency manipulation. And it tells them that we are committed to starting that process today. Yesterday, I outlined some of the serious problems with the unilateral approach adopted by the proponents of this bill. Allow me to summarize them for the benefit of my colleagues. First, this is not a jobs measure. Proponents of the unilateral approach argue that their bill will create thousands of jobs right now and millions of jobs in the years ahead. But all we have to do is take a close look at the numbers and the process laid out in the bill to see that this is not the case. I'm also concerned that the bill will inject economic instability in a key bilateral relationship and subject U.S. exporters to potential retaliation by the Chinese. Yesterday, the White House also expressed concerns about this bill, though they still have not stated publicly what those specific concerns are. I wish they would. It would be helpful to us up here to have the White House weigh in and say what they really want, instead of just waiting for the Senate to do whatever it wants to. A growing chorus has come out to criticize the unilateral approach in this bill. A growing chorus. The New York Times called this bill a, quote, bad idea, unquote, and, quote, too blunt of an instrument, unquote, which, if enacted, is very unlikely to persuade China to change its practices while adding another explosive new conflict to an already heavy list of bilateral frictions. The Wall Street Journal called the underlying bill, quote, the most dangerous trade legislation in many years, unquote. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a letter yesterday stating that the unilateral approach in the underlying bill would be counterproductive in persuading China to alter its currency practices and that, quote, in the end, such unilateral action would very likely cause retaliation by China and ultimately damage the U.S. economy, including exporters, investors, workers, and consumers, unquote. It doesn't get any tougher than that. Again, there is a better way. My amendment calls for a bold new approach which will empower United States negotiators to work within the WTO and IMF to develop long-term effective remedies to counter the effect of currency manipulation by China or any other country, and develop practices to persuade countries to stop currency manipulation. If that does not work within 90 days, they are directed to go outside of these institutions. My amendment, which would also send a great message to both the ILO, or excuse me, the WTO and the IMF. I'm used to talking about the ILO from my days as Labor Committee chairman. My amendment also would establish a new priority negotiating objective. So as we negotiate trade agreements with our trading partners, we should all commit in those agreements to not manipulate our currencies. My amendment also ensures that we have a partner by holding the administration accountable until they achieve results. And that's whether it's this administration or some administration in the future. Now, this is not a quick fix, but truly resolving complex and long-standing problems such as currency manipulation will take much more than a quick fix. It requires that we stand together as a country and do the hard work necessary with the international community to achieve real long-term results. And although my amendment was only recently introduced, it is already gaining widespread support. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed the Hatch Amendment, arguing that coordinated and multilateral pressure through international organizations is essential to encouraging China to adopt market-determined currency and exchange rate policies. That is precisely the approach taken in the Hatch Amendment. This morning, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, wrote in National Review Online that the Hatch Amendment, quote, is a more complex solution to the currency problem, unquote. And while, quote, not nearly as sexy or slogan-inspiring as the Currency Exchange Oversight Reform Act, happens to have a much greater likelihood of being effectual. The Hatch bill does, unquote. Americans for Tax Reform wrote a letter in support of my amendment saying that the Hatch Amendment, quote, offers a sensible approach that utilizes the mechanisms created by the international trade community to resolve such disputes, unquote. The Emergency Committee for American Trade says that the Hatch Amendment, quote, will more effectively address concerns about currency misalignment by China and other countries without opening the door to many harmful effects on U.S. business and workers, unquote. These and other organizations, such as the Retail Industry Trade Association and the Financial Services Roundtable, recognize that there is a better way. Let's quit playing politics with this issue. Today we face a clear choice. By voting against cloture, we can stand against unilateralism, stand against protectionism, and stand against retaliation, and stand against, quote, quick fix, unquote, solutions and slogans. We can then turn to vote on my amendment, and that offers the prospect of real long-term and effective solutions that shows the Chinese and the world community that we are serious about solving this problem over the long haul, and tells this and subsequent administrations that they will be held accountable. Even the administration basically agrees with this. Today we have an opportunity to make a difference. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote today that, quote, we have a trade problem with China, but Georgians will pay dearly if Congress keeps taking the wrong approach to solving it, unquote. I could not agree more. But I would say it's not just Georgians who will pay dearly, but all Americans. I urge my colleagues to make the right choice today to vote against cloture and support my amendment. I'm even willing to give my amendment to the distinguished senator from New York and others. Have it be their amendment. I don't care who gets the credit for it. I just want to have, when we work on trade issues, I want to have them work right. I don't want to have politics played with this. This is too important to have politics played with it. So I hope everybody votes against cloture. And I hope that we can then take up this amendment that I've been talking about. We can refile it so that those who feel so deeply about the Schumer Amendment can be for something. I would like to do that. I would like to see this done. I would like to see our country move ahead in an intelligent approach towards currency and trade. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Alabama.
Madam President, I would say that the majority leader has agreed that if cloture is invoked, that Senator Hatch's amendment will be one of the amendments that would be voted on. That was an agreement, and other amendments, too, would be allowed. I do believe that minority has to protect the right to offer amendments, and consistent with other processes we've had here that I'm not happy with, the amendments offered by the majority, I believe, are legitimate. I'm a bit offended and don't appreciate the view that this is a protectionist piece of legislation. I believe it protects free trade because trade can't exist when one party is manipulating the rules in a significant way that substantially impacts the balance of trade. And I would just cite that, ask the question, is presidential candidate, former Governor Mitt Romney, a protectionist? Is Governor Huntsman from Utah, presidential candidate, President Obama's ambassador to China, who said he would sign this bill if it came before him if he's elected president? Rob Portman, a fabulous new senator here who was President Bush's trade representative, he said he supports the bipartisan legislation, so I don't think it's protectionism. I think it's an effort to protect trade. Now, there's some that are religious about free trade. It's a religion with them. They believe that no matter how bad our trading partners act, that we should not retaliate because that might cause a trade war. I think that's not against common sense. Trade is not my religion. I think any trading relationship should depend on how well the agreement served the interest of both parties. It's like any other business relationship. Is it serving the interest of both parties? And this trade situation is a dramatic factor in the American loss of jobs. It is indisputable, in my opinion. A group of professors from California have said our trade imbalance over the last decade has cost 10 million jobs. And let me just say that we're going to have dynamic changes in our economy. That happens all the time. There are winners and losers, and we can compete with China and are in many different ways. But when you give them a currency advantage as large as this, good companies capable of competing and being successful be hammered. The middle class in this country are being hammered. This has got to stop. And we have to ask ourselves, is this country going to abandon its commitment or belief in a manufacturing economy? Are we going to give up manufacturing entirely? I don't think that's remotely conceivable. But we've had brilliant economists tell us we need to be a service economy, and we just deal with computers and emails and things and move paper around. And if this creates growth and wealth, you need a manufacturing economy. So I'm pleased to support. See my colleague Senator Brown, who's been a strong advocate of this. I say Senator Schumer and Senator Graham, who've been at this for years. I voted for their legislation in 2005. But I've really become energized about this because I believe it's a deep responsibility for every government official to protect our national security and to protect our economic security. And when we have clear evidence that a predatory trade policy of a major world exporter, the largest exporter in the history of the world to any country is China to the United States. They are abusing their trade privileges, and the administrations refuse to act. I say that Congress can and should act. I believe this is a reasonable bill. It allows the administration to negotiate an end to this matter over a period of time, and it will provide the power and the requirements that happen.
For a question.
I would be pleased, Senator.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you. Senator Sessions, I appreciate your consistent push for fair trade policies. We've worked on some Alabama, Ohio joint issues from sleeping bags to steel, and I appreciate that. You had said that how important manufacturing is, that we can't just turn to a service economy or we begin to lose the middle class, and I appreciate your advocacy there. Would you sort of explain again in the last couple of minutes before the debate's wrapped up what this currency depreciation, if you will, the Chinese do, what it does to their economy? Senator Merkel yesterday during the debate explained that when we export to China, their currency advantage, their artificial currency advantage, gives the Chinese as a 25% tariff on our sales to China, making it harder for a Montgomery or a Dayton company to sell into China. And coming the other way, it's a 25% subsidy to the Chinese company or the Chinese government's company selling in Mobile or selling in Cincinnati. Could you sort of just as we wrap the debate up, kind of go through that again, the point of what currency does to manufacturing in the middle class? And thank you for
raising that. Yes, and if a manufacturing company in Dayton is competing with a Chinese company to manufacture a widget, they can, on the currency alone, more than have an advantage shipping the product from China here to have a 25% advantage. And as you know, in the modern trade and sales today, margins are very small. 25% is a huge margin that would be provided by the currency alone. Then you have the things that are done in China to block our companies moving and selling there that go beyond the currency, but it also adds to the price of our goods as we attempt to sell them in China. So this is not a two-way street. And I believe that any rational government should not allow its manufacturing industry and its workers to be subjected to such unfair practices. We have an absolute responsibility to stand up and fix it. The best way to do it is the bill that Senator Schumer and Graham and Brown and others have offered. I believe it will do it in a rational, effective way, and other alternatives are less effective and will not do the job. It's time for us to do it now, Madam President. I would yield the floor and reserve the balance of the time.
President, what is the time status for both majority and minority?
The majority has no time remaining. The minority has 2 minutes remaining.
Well, since they're much better at this than us, I'm happy to.
Madam President, I would yield the 2 minutes to Senator Schumer or Brown.
Well, all four of us, Madam President,
Senator from New York.
all four of us have spoken. I just, again, would make a plea to my colleagues. We've had 8 months talking about debt, and many have said that's the future for our children and grandchildren, and I think there's a consensus on both sides of the aisle that that is true. But I would argue that this is also about the future for our children and grandchildren, because if good American companies with great ideas are wiped out in the next 10 years, as they will be if China's allowed to continue its predatory practices, the future for our children and grandchildren in this country will not be bright. Our seed corn, our family jewels, are being decimated by a plague of unfair competition that has been allowed. It's as if we have a plague and some of the leaders of this country, whether they be political or economic, shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's that. We can't do much about it. But in a bipartisan way, we have come together and said we can do something about this plague. And we are at the moment of decision. It is my belief, Madam President, that if we pass this here in a bipartisan way, as we have to, the way the Senate works, that the House will then, they may not take our bill up exactly, but they'll do something. We'll have a conference committee, and we can get something done. And the odds are quite high that when China sees the train heading down the track, when their ability, and I've seen the articles, I wanted to read some of them into the record, I don't have them with me, of China urging American companies with plants in China to lobby against this bill. But when China sees the train heading down the track and that for the first time their efforts, they and their multinational allies to stall this bill won't succeed, they will adjust and correct themselves, not just on currency, Madam President, but on all the other areas where they don't treat us fairly. So this is an important vote and an important day for America, and I yield the floor. Madam President?